Usually, when the dust settles on a massive, shocking case, society goes looking for a really simple explanation. You know the one. We want a narrative that makes sense of the unthinkable. We go looking for a monster, a predator, a completely broken individual who is somehow just hiding in plain sight. And honestly, it's a comforting thought. Because if the danger is just a bizarre anomaly, then the rest of our world is safe, right? But today we're going to dive into a reality that is far more unsettling. We aren't looking at a typical true crime ending today, or some triumphant justice-served wrap-up. In this explainer, we are looking at the invisible architecture of betrayal.
To really grasp the John Worboys case, we have to immediately shatter that true crime illusion we rely on so heavily. The danger here, it was never external. It was never outside the structures we use to navigate our everyday lives.
Actually, he operated directly through it. The system itself literally became the disguise. The taxi was trusted. The licensing was trusted. The whole overarching structure of public transit, trusted. And it's exactly that trust that created a perfect environment where suspicion felt completely, absolutely unnecessary.
So, I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we deconstruct this illusion of safety. What happens when trust itself becomes concealment? It is a deeply unsettling thought, isn't it? Because when the very things designed to keep us secure become the main tools used to hide a threat, well, the rules of survival completely change.
Let's start with part 1, the architecture of trust.
We usually think of trust as an emotion, right? A warm feeling of safety we extend to our friends and family. But in modern society, trust is structural. It is the literal physical infrastructure of our cities. Think of it as automatic trust. Our society only functions because we collectively stop questioning certain everyday systems. We don't interrogate the structural integrity of every bridge we drive over, and we don't demand to see the background check of every licensed professional we interact with. We just assume the system already did that for us.
Think about these incredibly mundane systems for a second. Taxis, public transit, professional licensing, heavily regulated environments, our cities absolutely depend on them. But here's the realization. This automatic reliance is the exact vulnerability that was exploited here. The predator didn't actually have to work to earn the victim's trust. The system had already handed it to him on a silver platter.
This thought captures the core mechanism beautifully, though tragically. Passengers entered the cab believing they had already passed the danger. They were inside a licensed, regulated vehicle. That assumption of safety, it actually became the mechanism of the crime. Once they stepped inside that highly trusted environment, their natural defenses were lowered, entirely by design.
Which brings us to part 2, memory as a battlefield.
The physical assaults in this case were only the first layer of trauma. The psychological aftermath is where things get even more disturbing. Victims woke up to an entirely unstable reality, unable to fully explain what had just happened to them. Their memories were fragmented. Hours of time had simply disappeared. The details felt entirely unstable. And inside that terrifying uncertainty, a second layer of damage started to form. This deep, pervasive self-doubt. And this leads to a truly devastating paradox. From the system's point of view, these memory gaps were interpreted as a weakness. It reduced the victim's credibility. But the reality? The amnesia was evidence of the method itself. The memory gaps were not a flaw in the testimony. They were the direct result of the crime. Yet the very symptom of the attack was used by the system to dismiss the people who survived it.
Moving to part 3, the systemic delay.
So, how do our institutions actually process danger? Why did this massive threat remain completely invisible for years? It forces us to ask, how many warning signs have to exist before a system finally reacts? Because danger is rarely invisible just because evidence is absent. It's way more complicated than that.
Let's walk through this cycle of unrecognized danger. First, the evidence arrives, but it arrives in fragments. Second, that automatic trust we just talked about, it actively delays any immediate suspicion. Third, and this is absolutely crucial, systems inherently require repetition before they reach certainty. A few fragmented reports just don't create enough urgency. And finally, step 4, by the time the patterns actually form and become clear, the harm is already accumulated. Recognition only came after repetition.
So I want to leave this question hanging for just a moment. Can institutions ever recognize danger before that repetition occurs? Or are we completely reliant on reactive systems that essentially demand a certain quota of harm before they'll even acknowledge a threat exists?
Let's look at part 4, the fracture of institutions.
You know, even after a conviction is finally secured,
the instability from that broken trust doesn't just vanish. In 2018, there were discussions about the possible release of John Worboys on parole, and the public reaction was immediate, and it was fierce. But we have to understand, this wasn't just political drama or your standard legal news cycle. It was undeniable proof of a profound institutional fracture.
Because by 2018, the conversation was no longer just about one single offender. It was about whether the system itself could ever be trusted to recognize danger correctly again. For so many people, the mere possibility of his release didn't look like rehabilitation. It felt like the system failing to recognize the pattern all over again. The public simply no longer trusted the institutional judgment.
And this perfectly ties in to the massive cultural weight behind the phrase, "believe me." In any society built on automatic trust, victims are forced to fight a huge second battle long after they've survived the initial trauma. They have to somehow convince the system that the trusted environment itself was the danger. And historically, as we've seen time and time again, that is one of the hardest truths for any institution to accept.
Which brings us to part 5, when danger feels normal.
Because this whole thing isn't just about one man in London. It's actually a shadow protocol of systemic danger, and we can trace it across completely unrelated historical events. Take Operation Midnight Climax, where intelligence agencies secretly experimented on unsuspecting citizens in safe houses. Compare that to a predator weaponizing public infrastructure. On the surface, total opposites, right? But look closer. Both relied entirely on trusted spaces. Both involved delayed victim recognition because of induced memory issues. And both required a massive accumulation of harm before the system finally reacted. Dangerous systems work best when they feel normal. They exploit the very environments we are conditioned to trust, because institutional legitimacy actively suppresses our suspicion.
And that leads us to this incredibly chilling realization. The most effective systems are not the ones people fear, they are the ones people stop questioning. The most disturbing takeaway from all of this isn't simply that danger managed to exist inside these systems. It's that the systems themselves made the danger appear completely, boringly normal.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want us to really reflect on the reality of the spaces we move through every single day. The danger here was never completely hidden. It didn't even have to be.
It simply moved through environments that people had already agreed were safe. It hid right out in the open, completely cloaked in licensing and public trust. And by the time the pattern became undeniable, well, the pattern had already existed for years.
So we're left with this final, deeply unsettling thought. If our safety relies so heavily on systems that can be so easily weaponized just by being normal, what happens to our cities, our institutions, our daily lives? What exactly does society lose if trust disappears completely? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.